All right, hello everyone. I think we still have people coming into the waiting room, but I think it's time to get started on the 13th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age. My name is Lynn Ransom. I'll be moderating today's event, but first I want to hand it over to Sean Quimby, who is the recently arrived director of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. Sean?
Thank you, Lynn, and good morning or good day, as the case may be, to all of you joining us. As Lynn mentioned, I'm the newly appointed Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Director of the J. Kislak Center. In the 2.5 months that I've been at Penn, I've enjoyed learning more about the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies that my longtime colleague, Will Knoll, helped to shape in recent years, and which he aptly described as a think tank for manuscript studies. The extended SIMS team, which includes Nick Herman, Lynn, of course, Dot Porter, Doug Emery, and many others, brings a rare combination of subject expertise and technical savvy, incubating new ideas like the future of digital scriptorium, developing new tools like École, and platforms like Penn, disseminating scholarship, the Manuscript Studies Journal, and generally providing a space, both physical and virtual, for people to think about manuscripts and manuscriptness in a global context. Though I'm not myself a medievalist, I am trained as a historian of technology. And as such, I like to think that I'm well attuned to the context for and implications of technological decisions, the kinds of things that Sarah Werner invites us to consider in her scholarship and blog. To this end, I've been impressed with the SIMS team collective self-awareness as it brings new digital technology to bear on a very old one in response to ever-changing research agendas. And so I want to acknowledge their work, even as I welcome you to the 13th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age. I'd also like to acknowledge Barbara Brisdell, Larry Schoenberg's widow, who is joining us. It's Barbara and Larry's shared vision that brings us here today. Of course, the other thing that brings us here today seems to me quintessentially medieval, a plague. COVID forces us to come together virtually, and in so doing, we have the opportunity to stretch our imaginations a little bit further, to reflect on how the radical global connectivity that has reordered our work and lives in the past 6 months might shape digital manuscript studies in the years to come. For this reason, the next few days promise to be especially rich and robust. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the symposium, and back to you, Lynn.
All right, thank you, Sean. First, I can't tell you how delighted we at the Schoenberg Institute are to be welcoming everyone to this year's event. While I see already so many familiar faces, I'm thrilled to be seeing so many new ones that I hope will soon become familiar as we take this opportunity to get to know each other around our shared interest in manuscript studies over the course of the next few days. Around this time last year, after completing the 12th Annual Schoenberg Symposium, I started looking ahead and realized that this year would be the 13th symposium, the unlucky number. I laughed at my superstitious self and thought, really, Lynn, what could go wrong? Well, here we are, sitting alone in front of our computer screens after so much has happened in 2020 that we could never have imagined. So congratulations to everyone making it this far. This year has seen one crisis after another, and to cope, I've been remembering a quote, and I think it's from John F. Kennedy, that the Chinese character for crisis is composed of two characters, one for danger and one for opportunity. As the world shut down in March, and many of us are now entering a new phase of shutdown as I speak, I'm sure that many of us saw danger not only in our personal, political, and social lives, but also in our academic and research lives. We study manuscripts, physical objects that are now inaccessible to most of us. How are we to do our work? What is going to happen? But as much as we might worry about these dangers, I have been inspired by how many of us have found opportunities in this time of crisis to think about and approach manuscript studies in different online and digital ways. To be sure, the field of manuscript studies has been on the forefront of digital scholarship since the Italian Jesuit priest and theologian Roberto Busa began using computational methods to index the works of Thomas Aquinas in the 1950s with IBM. Manuscript scholars have also led the way in digitization of manuscripts since the late 1990s, and I'm thinking in particular of Digital Scriptorium, led by Consuelo Dutschke at Columbia. It's just one example. Indeed, in the last decades, digital manuscript studies have flourished. But I think it's safe to say that we now stand at a crossroads and at an opportunity to assess where we have been, where we are now, and where we need to go next. This is the purpose. This is our purpose over the next 3 days. To this end, we have invited 9 people to present in morning sessions, short papers that reflect on these questions, or to present projects that are grappling with how best to gather, manage, and share new data and new research in the digital age. In the afternoons, panel discussions will be led by 3 experts who will present responses and further reflections on papers presented in the morning sessions. Each day treats a different theme that we have asked our speakers to give special consideration to. Today's theme is looking back, aiming forward. Tomorrow we'll be considering access and discovery, inclusion and exclusion. And on Friday, we will look more closely at the mechanics of our online world with the theme interrogating interfaces and digital representation, images, metadata, and screens. We hope that you as the audience will play an active role in contributing your questions and ideas to the discussion. After each presentation in the morning session, or I should say the first session for those of you who are not who are past the morning, you will have a brief opportunity to ask each speaker about their particular project. And in the afternoon, we will open the floor to a more lengthy discussion following the panelists' presentations. A virtual conference is a new platform for the Schoenberg Symposium and has required us to fundamentally change the typical schedule. And the danger is that we don't really know what the next 3 days are going to be like. But we are excited at the opportunities afforded by a virtual platform to, for one, be able to include so many more people around the table than we would have in previous years. So thank you all for your interest and your patience as we embark on this adventure. A virtual platform has also allowed us to think more creatively about other ways to include new and more projects and people. I want to draw your attention to 2 events that we have been able to include that we otherwise might not have done in the previous iteration of the symposium. The first is a project led by Dr. Laura Moriali called Scholarly Editing COVID-19 Style, where she is leading a 3-day crowdsourcing effort to transcribe, edit, and submit for publication an edition of the text Le Pèlerinage de Demoiselle, sorry, cannot do my French this morning, de Demoiselle Sapience from UPenn MS Codex 660. The transcription team kicked off their work this morning in a separate meeting, and by Friday, there will be a digital edition ready to submit to a journal, we hope. Laura will speak about 2 similar events conducted since the shutdown on Thursday morning, and then we'll present the results of the COVID-19 style editing event on Friday at the virtual coffee and/or wine hour at the end of the day. If you're on Twitter, you can follow the project with the hashtag Demoiselle Sapience. And Laura, if you could maybe chat that for everyone's benefit, that would be great. The second event is an asynchronous showing of 25 5-minute lightning round talks representing the breadth of scholarship in the field taking place now. The links to the playlist and to the individual programs individual videos are available via the symposium website, which is available in the chat. The link is available in the chat. We are especially thrilled at how many submissions we received and how well each one was produced. So a big thank you to all of you who's contributed videos. We will also be streaming the videos during the first 90 minutes of the long break between the morning and afternoon sessions, ending 30 minutes before the afternoon session begins so that we can get set up. Finally, I would like to offer my thanks to everyone who has made this event possible. First and foremost, and every year, I want to especially thank Barbara Bristol Schoenberg for her unending support and enthusiasm for what SIMS does to ensure Larry Schoenberg's legacy of open data and shared knowledge. She will be joining us throughout the event, so if you see her name on the list, chat her a thanks. She absolutely deserves it. I'd also like to acknowledge my deep gratitude to my colleagues at SIMS and Penn Libraries, especially those on this year's planning committee, Josie Dummer, Dot Porter, Nick Herman, Doug Emery, Kelly Tuttle, and Emma Thompson. And their faces should be visible throughout the event. So please say hi. And an even more special thanks to Penn Library's IT support staff, Betsy Deming and Doug Smollins, who have been and will be virtually holding my hand and keeping us going for the next 3 days. Before we kick off, I'd like to review some administrative details. First, each day will be run by a moderator. Today it will be me. We have also assigned roles for people to monitor the chat and the questions. Today, Dot Porter will be the question monitor, and she will follow questions that are posted in the chat and either read the questions or unmute the person asking to let them speak for themselves. If you want to speak, we're going to suggest turning on your video or doing the raise hand function so that Dot will know that you want to ask it. Otherwise, just put the question in and Dot will read it. Jesse Dummer will be monitoring the chat and the participants, letting them into the meeting and making sure everyone acts respectfully, which I shouldn't have to remind because I'm sure we're all going to. As we will ask everyone to mute their mics and videos during presentations, she will monitor that as well and mute you if necessary. If you have questions for her, please direct chat her. Emma Thompson will also be recording the presentations excuse me, from her device. We will be posting recordings as soon as we can to our YouTube channel, and we'll make that link available. I'm not sure how long this is going to take, but we'll try to get it up by the end of today. Should you have concerns about recording, please direct chat Emma Thompson to let us know. We're also aiming to save the chats for documentation purposes. If you have a question we do not have time to get to it, especially in the morning sessions when the question period is brief, feel free to write it in the chat if you'd like to have it on record. So enough of me, let's get the show on the road. And as we do, I remind you to mute your mics and videos. And I think I'm going to start out introducing each speaker before their turn. And as I mentioned, after each person has spoken, you'll have the opportunity to ask them questions directly before we move to the next person. So we're ready. Our first speaker is Peter Stokes. Peter is a research professor in digital and computational humanities applied to historical writing at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, Université PSL. Peter is a recognized pioneer in developing new methods of quantitative and computer-based paleography, including perhaps his most well-known project, Digipal, digital resource and database for paleography, manuscript studies, and diplomatic. His current primary research focus is on multigraphism, or the use of different scripts or writing systems, particularly in medieval Europe, combining the fields of paleography, digital humanities, and informatics. Today, he will consider these topics and others in his talk entitled Digital and Computational Paleography, Some Promises and Problems. Thank you, Peter, and welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope share my screen. I think you should now be able to see. So yes, thank you very much for the invitation and many thanks to all the organizers. I'm extremely happy to be able to participate finally, even if virtually. The Schoenberg Symposium is something I've been watching enviously from a distance for a long time, but never yet managed to attend. So I'm certainly happy to be participating now. And I'm going to try to reflect a little bit on, in a sense, where we have been and where we're going in paleography and manuscript studies. And as suggested to see in particular where COVID might be turning things. And this question of access that was raised briefly is something that's come very much part of what I'm going to be talking about. We all know here extremely well, I think, that the last 15 or 20 years or so, we've seen an enormous increase in digital images, manuscripts, as well as tools to be working with them, which has been enabled by a combination of technological developments, but also what one might call social changes in the sense of more or less open, more access to open images, and indeed to software for that matter, more investments at local, national and international level in digitization and indeed in open platforms and software and international standards, thinking here particularly of IIIF and other examples like that. So just one very quick example, which you probably know. This is the Biblissima site, which brings together, at the moment, as you see, around 75,000 digitized manuscripts and rare books. That is AAAF manifests leading to images and descriptions of manuscripts and rare books, meaning that one can simply search here for Torah Bible or whatever it is you want, get potentially dozens of hits and images to go with them. And of course, an API behind the scenes, which allows one to connect and access the images directly. And of course, there are many, many other examples of this, including ones that we will hear about throughout the week. And I think it's clear that this is, or at least can be, a huge boon, a huge benefit. As noted in the overview to the conference, in many ways, we were indeed ready when most of the world's manuscript libraries became inaccessible in March or thereabouts. In France, we are now in a second lockdown, but I can sit at home, consult images of tens of thousands of manuscripts scattered across Europe and beyond. This does, of course, pose interesting questions and challenges, some of which I'll put here for now, which I will partly address, particularly as we go through this discussion. It also includes limitations, and many people in the audience and other people who are going to speak have already addressed this in a lot of detail, but I think it's now clear that the availability of digital images is not, of course, availability of the object, even though we often forget that, and there are questions around what access means here. I think we'll also agree that to understand manuscripts requires not only the digital, but also direct physical access. And there is a real risk that more resources in digitization can, though it doesn't have to mean, fewer resources for librarians, cataloging, conservation, and so on. I'm thinking there are many examples, but I'm sure some of you saw the National Library of Israel over the summer, which suspended all activities and put 300 staff on temporary leave, citing budget cuts partly connected to COVID. So that's exactly what we're here to discuss, what this means and where this brings it. By the way, just in passing, I don't think this is a zero-sum game in the sense that greater exposure to greater access, in a sense, to images and to content has led, I think, to greater interest in paleography, codicology, and manuscript studies in general. How this translates into funding is much less clear at this point. So none of this is new to COVID, but we are seeing some signs of it changing already. I mentioned the library and other libraries, of course, have had periods of closure at least. We're also seeing now drafts of the new Horizon Europe funding program, which is setting European funding priorities for the next 7 years. And one of the calls listed there, which as far as I know is certainly going ahead, is aimed very specifically at increasing digital approaches to cultural heritage. And it does refer explicitly to COVID as a motivating factor there. So the funding landscape, at least in Europe, and I'm sure elsewhere, is already changing as we're speaking almost. The funding call, and indeed in general, does raise this question of access and digitization as democratization in the sense of making things available. And this is a question that has long bothered me and again, many others. I'm personally very privileged, very lucky. I spent most of my career, all of my career, in fact, either in Cambridge, the UK, London, or in Paris. So I've had access, relatively easy access to medieval manuscripts and extremely impressive libraries. But of course, that's not true for everybody. It's very easy for me to sit here and say access to original manuscripts is essential. But what does that say about people who don't have such privilege, such access? And of course, part of the idea of the digital is to try to increase this and share it in some form. Paleography teaching definitely is very different from where I started 20 years ago. Now, rather than giving people black and white printouts, we can send people not only to high quality images, but to say, here is one example of a tool Bible or whatever it is. Now go find 20 others, compare them, look at them in more detail. More generally, teach mainly digital humanities these days, including master's students working on cultural heritage, for instance. And it's well within the capacity of good students to write Python scripts to harvest hundreds of images and manuscript pages via AAAF, process them automatically, estimating basic statistics like proportions of page, numbers of lines per page, and so on, and then mapping out developments over time, over geography, this sort of thing is something that a good master's student can do very easily these days. So from that point of view also, the access through these digital methods is really increasing enormously. Not to mention crowdsourcing, including projects just mentioned before, game sourcing as well, using games to engage people to also help put data together to raise interest in skills and so forth. Again, that may or may not lead to investments in posts, but it's certainly increasing interest and availability to well, paleography and manuscript studies in general. But there are a few other areas which are perhaps a bit less evident and which I think are starting to really, really change things as well. One that I've noticed more and more is a lot more interest from the computer science community in the analysis of historical documents. So thinking back 15 years or so ago to when Arianna Ciulla published her seminal article, I believe the first to use digital paleography in this term, there are very few people in general working on this, and particularly from computer science. There were some exceptions. Lambert Schulmacher, probably the best known, who's still a leader in the field today. But I was told quite often by computer scientists that historical documents are not interesting and are a so-called solved problem. But now the International Conference in Document Analysis and Recognition, which existed then, has existed for a long time, but it now has a regular dedicated session on historical documents. There's the International Conference on Frontiers in Handwriting Recognition, which is also very much interested in historical documents and is growing rapidly. And very promisingly, they are having very open discussions of how much they need to involve us in the sense of how important it is to involve people from the humanities in this work. So again, when we're talking about opening and access, there's the intellectual and the disciplinary, as well as the access to the images and the content. But there are some other areas as well where I think things have really changed very significantly in the last year or two, really. And one of these areas, which may surprise some of you who know me to hear me saying this, but I'm becoming increasingly interested in the impact of artificial intelligence and deep learning. Now, this is something that I've spent many years arguing against, in fact, but not in general. What I am still concerned about, as we'll see, are specific applications where there are still very real questions. But having said that, we are starting to see more and more, particularly as AI becomes more and more accessible, more and more effective, the necessary computers are becoming available, and the necessary people are becoming interested. We're getting examples that are starting to work extremely well. In fact, I don't know how many of you know, but AI and paleography, in the broad sense, have had a very long history together. Douglas Hofstadter, a famous writer and researcher, mainly from the 80s, he worked in AI, but he was very much preoccupied by writing. So much so that he wrote that the central problem of artificial intelligence is the question, what is the letter A? In fact, this is the question that has obsessed me for many years now in some respects. What is the letter A? Really? How can we even answer that? And what does that say for paleography, or indeed for AI, that we can't easily answer a question as fundamental as this? Now, some people have looked at this, some people have approached it. For instance, I more or less stumbled across this. This was a blog post by Eric Bernhardson, who I don't know, but he's clearly a developer, software developer. And he decided, more or less on a whim by the look of it, to download 50,000 computer fonts, train a neural network on them, carry out various statistical analyses, and then program the network to generate new characters in different styles. And this is something that is now accessible enough that I don't know what computer he used, but it looks like he literally just did it from his home in one evening. Another example, a project my team in Paris is working on, the team that I'm part of, called eScriptorium, which has another software called Kraken behind it, which is one of several projects using machine learning to automatically transcribe manuscripts. Unlike some of the other examples, this software is freely available and open online. You can download it and use it yourself if you have the necessary technical skills. As you probably know already, you need to train the computer how to read your particular manuscript by showing it many lines of images that have already been transcribed. And this, of course, takes a lot of work. You or somebody needs to sit down and actually do this. And as we'll see, an active area of research is how to reduce this work. But one of the things that's happening here that we are doing is that, unlike the others, once you have trained your system, your model for your particular script, you can then, that model is open and freely exportable and shareable. So for instance, we do have access to a fairly powerful computer. I can train a model on, say, 11th century English manuscripts. It's my particular interest. But then I can export it and give it to you, who maybe you don't have access to the same sort of computer. And then you can retrain it a little bit for your manuscripts, not needing the same sort of firepower that we'd have here. Thereby saving a huge amount of time, not to mention energy, environmental resources, and so on, and opening this up, making it more and more accessible compared to retraining from scratch. Now, when these and other similar projects are really going, combined with things like IIIF, things start getting very interesting. And now we're starting to look at Time Machine, some of these other projects, but ones that don't necessarily need millions, if not billions of euros, but we're starting to be able to do this even from our computers at home. But we have access, right, to IIIF, to tens of thousands, if not millions of images. We're starting to get models which can transcribe at least a small set of these up to 99.5, 99.9% accuracy. But even if it's, say, only 80% accurate, that's more than enough to identify texts, probably identify which variants or versions of text there are, maybe to do some basic linguistic analysis, such as identification of dialect. Certainly more than enough to do things like counting lines of pages and proportions and so on. Maybe even identifying ownership inscriptions, glosses, and other information. So this is getting to the point again where we can do it at home. We can give it to our students to do these sorts of things for assignments. And again, that's really changing where we are. Again, it's not quite true that we can really train these high-powered models on a home computer, but again, that's coming. In video, for instance, I noticed has released an ultra-cheap hobbyist version of a GPU, the sort of thing you need for training AI. It's in a sense a Raspberry Pi for AI, which they're starting to release, not to mention what phones and other things can do, the resources that Google and other companies provide. In fact, another area of slightly strange democratization, perhaps, a little surprising, perhaps. I mentioned that one of the barriers is that you need a lot of work to train your materials, to prepare transcriptions to feed to the machine to train. And believe it or not, this connects to another area of democratization, if you like, or popularization, namely deepfakes. If you haven't heard of this, this is technology which is now all over social networks, where you can take a video of Barack Obama or Vladimir Putin or whoever you like, and have it sort of imitate a video of you, for instance. You take the two videos and it maps one onto the other. But the same technology is also being used by computer scientists, and yes, indeed, to deepfake manuscripts. This is one where they've taken, again, a text that was, I think, handwritten or typed, I don't remember, and mapped it to styles of handwriting in other documents. So of these words, 5 of them are real in the sense that were actually written by a person. The rest were generated by an AI imitating the style of a particular script. Why would you want to do that? Well, maybe for outreach engagement, although I don't know of projects that do that. But what they are doing is using this to take a text that you already know, you deep fake that text to make it look like your 11th century vernacular script or whatever it is. You train your computer to read the deep fake manuscript, and then you give it a real manuscript afterwards to read itself, one where you don't know. And it turns out actually this works extremely well. So we're starting to get more and more of these cases where this AI is being applied, for instance, to to deepfake handwriting, to transcribe manuscripts, to do all sorts of interesting things there. And that may well, that has in fact raised the question whether we have in sense answered Hofstadter's question about what is the letter A. In a sense, we have managed to solve this problem, right? We can generate A's, we can read A's all with a machine. But where in this is all the paleography? To quote another important person from computer science, Donald Knuth, the best way to understand something is to know it so well that you can teach it to a computer. The process of seeking such explanations will surely be instructive for all concerned. But have we really learnt to understand this so well that we can teach it to a computer? Some people say so. This was a Reddit thread. I didn't read the whole thread, but it was looking at this quotation of Hofstadter and sort of laughing at him, saying we're beyond that. Clearly, we've answered this problem. But I don't think actually it's quite that straightforward. What is the letter A? Is this really an answer? I would suggest not. And this leads on to another common theme, which is becoming more and more important, I think, and again is something where the digital and the computer science are coming together more and more, including in paleography, are the questions around transparency in AI and machine learning. What does this really mean? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to accelerate a bit, but there's some references there and some discussion to keep going with. So we can have an answer. We can have the machine that tells us this is the letter A, but is an answer really enough? This is Khalid Sirat, a Hebrew paleographer, creating Popper, saying that two things which are similar, always similar in certain respects, but this presupposes a particular point of view. In order for our digital methods to be useful, then, we need to find ways for allowing for these different points of view, including different contexts. So how we take that into account in our approaches more generally, our digital approaches, I think, is much more challenging. For instance, how do we account for different contexts and different writing systems? I have colleagues working on just about every historical script that you can imagine. And one example of the sort of page that we have to manage is something like this. The sort of bog standard, if you like, digital frameworks really don't handle this sort of thing very well at all. Even something very basic like a line of text can be extremely difficult to model, to incorporate into standards when we start looking at the details. So here we have our lines of text, but what is a line of text really? Well, it depends on the script, right? Is it a baseline? Is it a top line? Is it a vertical line? Is it a circle? In which direction does the script go? How do we model this? How do we represent this? These are easy cases compared to this, one of my favorites, a bilingual Hebrew-Chinese document, for instance, which has scripts going in different directions, and some in lines, some in columns, not to mention micrography, Hebrew, and other things. So how we manage that, how we really explain what these things are and how they work is much, much more complicated, I think. And to me, this is really where things are lacking a bit. How do we teach the computer what is the letter A? So this is one example of a particular attempt of mine, of a part of it, but obviously there's much, much more to go here, how we take these and how we put them together. So COVID has accelerated this process of digitization, yes, and it looks like the funding is also going to change directions a bit in this respect. What that means for traditional methods is much less clear, but in any case, the old questions clearly apply, I think. How to be relevant without oversimplifying, how to engage in the right way, how to pool our resources, and how to really understand what it is that we and the computer are doing. And that's my time, so thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you, Peter. I hear applause happening out in the stratosphere somewhere. That was a really great paper to start with. Thank you so much for raising some of these important issues. So we have about 10 minutes or so for questions.
Okay, so hi, I'm Dot, and I am the questions moderator. So there are a few questions in the chat. Please feel free to add more if you have a question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look you up, as your question comes up. And if you unmute your camera, I will tell you to ask your question. And if you don't, I will ask your question for you. So the first one is David Sheeby. You're unmuted, your camera's muted, but you are unmuted. So David, do you want to ask your question?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, there you are.
Okay,
Please ask
hi.
your question. Hi.
So you mentioned AI, and to me it's just a black box, but I don't understand what are the explicit features that are extracted for each letter. For example, what features are pulled out for the letter A? Is it a curvature feature? Is it a moment feature? What exactly is pulled out so that I can then go and recode that feature without needing some neural net for deep learning?
This is precisely the question, exactly. And it turns out it's extremely difficult to answer that question. So the whole field of explainable AI is a big field of research. There's some very interesting work in an article by Dominique Strutzmann, Mike Kestermont, and Vincent Christlein, I think it is. It's in the open access issue of Scriptorium from 2017, I think it is, where they have much more detailed discussion of this and some attempts to go in and look exactly for those features. But the simple answer is that's exactly the sort of thing that we need to understand better, because indeed, otherwise it is the black box.
Because I'm personally writing code using MATLAB to look at the Hebrew cursive script called Solatreo. I'm not using neural nets. I'm just doing it brute force, looking for curvature and moments. And the success rate right now is 30%, but I'll slowly make progress. But I'm shying away from neural nets because I want to know what it is I'm looking for. I don't want a black box to tell me it found something.
Sure, exactly. So this is the challenge. So for a transcription, this is very useful, I think, because we can see that it is correct and it may not or not, and understanding why may not be so important. For interpretation of, or for something like scribal attribution, it's much, much, much more complicated. And I think there we really have to understand better what's going on.
All right. Thank you. I am going to move on to the next question. Nancy Turner. Nancy Turner.
Just a quick question. What was the name of the program that you're using in this eScriptorium? You quickly mentioned it and I missed it.
Yes, so I think you can still see the screen, which has various links on it. So the way it works is Kraken is an open source module built by my colleague Ben Kislak, which in a sense does the work of the transcription. eScriptorium is a graphical interface because Kraken is very, very flexible, very, very powerful, but you have to sit there on the command line and actually, to a certain extent, do programming, or at least it's not so user-friendly. So the eScriptorium is a second layer which you can optionally use on top to make it more user-friendly.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Mike Toth. Mike, are you there? There you are. You're gonna have to unmute your mic too.
Hey there, good to be here. Mine's more a hypothetical question and warning, I think, in terms of, how do we prevent forgers and others from pernicious applications of the AI deep fake text to, to create forgeries here. There's a flip side to all of these things, and they've been using technology to good effect. Look at the Museum of the Bible fakes. So just kind of a warning there.
Yes, absolutely. I think in terms of if somebody discovered a new manuscript, a new fragment or something, I don't think anyone would want to say anything on the basis of an image. Of course, we would want to consult the physical object. And of course, there are still physical fakes as well. But yes, one could imagine slipping in things perhaps in a large corpus or adjusting, absolutely. Even before this, there's been quite a bit of work of, I mean, many people involved in things like recovering erased writing in palimpsests and so on. And even there is scope for abuse or for blurring the lines, let's say. So certainly, yes, that is a question for deepfakes in general and for manuscript studies in particular. So there are people working on algorithmic ways of doing that. And of course, being transparent and open once again, which again is the problem with the black box. It's very difficult to do that.
Thank you.
All right. We have one more question. Eugene Lyman, do you want to unmute yourself? I'm going to wait a couple seconds. Oh.
I hear.
You're there. Oh, you just muted
All right,
yourself. There you
Peter,
are.
Great talk. Oh. Am I okay now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Why should I be asking a question about computers? Peter, at what point must scholarly judgment be introduced to authenticate machine work? Is this an issue? I think it is. Should the introduction always be a part of the process of whatever work we're trying to accomplish? If so, how do we know where to draw the line? Too soon and we lose the efficiency of machine work. Too late or not at all, and we risk being misled by our own algorithms, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it depends a bit on the question. I've started putting some things together about this, but I think if there are questions where the answer is relatively clear, for instance, this is an A, this is not an A. Yes, we all know many examples where that's not clear, but in general, we can assume it is. That in a case like that, I think it matters. It doesn't need to be as early on in the process, shall we say. In a question like, were these two manuscripts written by the same person? That I'm not sure we can even answer that with a computer, in the sense that the computer can give me an answer. It can say yes or no, but what I do with that is not really helpful. So I think in a case like that, really from the very start, there has to be that understanding and intervention. So yes, you're absolutely right that there's a tension between getting things done and being clear about what happens. And there's also a case where a few errors may not matter so much. Again, the case of if we transcribe automatically 100,000 manuscripts, if 100 of them are completely wrong, that may not change the results so much, as long as we understand that there may be 100 that are wrong and we understand how to use that information. Clearly, we can't publish an edition on that basis, but we may be able to identify statistical patterns in the text or something. So yes, it's a tension, and I think it really depends on the particular case and how we manage that.
I guess that my point in asking the question has something to do with designing tools. At what point does the tool designer say, hey, I could spend another 3 weeks working on one specific area, but if a human is going to be looking at this and having to make a judgment anyway, maybe the thing to do is to make it very easy for the human to indicate what their judgment is and enter it into the process that way. It always seems to me easier to have the work done by the computer and then look at it to see if it's correct than to try and do all the work from the start. But at some point, you've got to step back and say, hey, what is scholarly judgment saying about all this?
Sure. And I think this ties into another discussion, which is the role of the things like the interface and the documentation and so on. And the simple reality is that more or less all of our projects, we are trying to get features and results and things that maybe we ourselves in the team can use, but trying to have other people use those tools or even understand those results requires a lot of investment in as you're saying, making things clear, making the interface available, documenting very carefully what's going on.
Yeah.
And even getting funding for that is extremely difficult, let alone finding people who are interested in it. But without it, it's very difficult to actually know how to use the results.
All
right, it's time to move on. So if there are more questions, we can address them in the second session. So I'll turn it back to Lynn.
Okay, thank you, Dot. And thank you, Peter. That was, again, excellent way to kick off the symposium. Alberto Campagnolo is our next speaker, and I think he'll be setting up his screen share. I don't see him right now on my screen, but I'm assuming he's there. So I will read his introduction while that is getting set up. So our second speaker today is Alberto Campagnolo. Alberto trained as a book conservator in Spoleto, Italy, as a prelude to further studies in digital culture and technology, completing his PhD on an automated visualization of historical bookbinding structures at the Legatus Research Center at the University of the Arts, London in 2015. Alberto is currently adjunct professor at the University of Udine and recently completed a clear postdoctoral fellowship in data curation at the Library of Congress, as well as a Schoenberg Institute visiting research fellowship in 2019. He has published widely in conservation and digital humanities, including as the editor of the recent collection of essays, Book Conservation and Digitization, The Challenges of Dialogue and Collaboration, which came out, I think, this past spring, and is available from Art Humanities Press. Today, he will discuss the topic, the elusive book, or the digitization of the materiality of books. Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Really. I've been a fan of SIMS from the very beginning, and it's nice to be here, even though only virtually. So yeah, so today I want to talk to you about what is it that is not really digitized yet, as Peter mentioned earlier, the book is not just the text or the pages. There is a lot more behind it. And so what is not digitized, and is there a way in which we can get this information into the computer and use it so that when COVID comes, we can actually study the books even though we can't use them. So I'm going to start off with a little anecdote. Exactly 20 years ago, I was a student in Spoleto, and John Lawrence Sharp came to give a lecture. John Lawrence Sharp is one of the eminent scholars of early bookbinding structures. So we went to Florence, and I went with him to prepare the lecture. And we went to a library, and we asked the librarian that we wanted to look at what bindings to show the students in the following week. And the librarian very nicely gave us access to the catalogs. It was the 18th century catalog in Latin. And we spent an hour trying to see whether we could find any information about the bindings in the catalog to choose the books. And really there was nothing. If binding was mentioned, as you see in the example here, it was only because it was a binding in the back state of conservation, which is not really enough information to go on. And it will tell us what kind of material the pages were made of, which is either parchment or paper. So after spending an hour flipping through the catalog, we finally managed to speak to another librarian, more sympathetic to the problem, and we finally got access to the stacks. There, by looking at the books in their physical entity, through the stacks, we were able to identify the books that we wanted to show the students. Of course, the catalog that I showed earlier is an extreme example. It was a very early catalog in Latin, so the cataloging tradition was very different. But still today, if you want to study books as objects, more often than not is the case that in order to really get to understand what we want to look at, you need to have access to the books, to the stacks, because otherwise through the catalog it's very difficult to understand what you want to pick, or you have to order up in the reading room a lot of books before finding the one that you want. Once when we're able to put together the books, then this is a kind of a typical example of what happens when people gather together to study book bindings. you really turn them around, you look into it, you get physical with them. And I know many librarians that get really stressed by this kind of approach, but that's the only way to really understand them. And as Lynn said, I'm a book conservator, so I am well aware that use can damage the book. So all of this has to be done without damaging the book primarily. But in order to study the books as object, this is the one approach that has to be done. And then COVID comes, and we can't really get access to the books anymore. But that's okay. We are digital humanists. There's a lot of information there on the web. A lot of books have been digitized. We have the AAAF that allows us to gather information from many different libraries, many different collections, and we can really get to really work with all of these different manuscripts and books without problems, right? We'll see about this. The one thing that we know is that a lot of more books are digitized and are being digitized nowadays. So there is information there that we can gather. And more, we're seeing that digitization doesn't just focuses on the pages with the text, but we get the full object represented. So you do find pictures also of the bindings and on the end leaves, if you're interested in that. Through AAAF, you can start to gather all of this information. Now, the metadata is a problem because it's not standard to call what part of binding you want to look at, but we can harness machine vision as an example here taken by a work done by Dominic Stutzman and his team, whereby the computer vision was used to analyze many different collections of AAAF images. And in this particular example, the bindings were extracted, and you can look exactly at just the binding images, which is the equivalent of being given access to the stacks in a way. In fact, even more information that you will get on the stacks. On the stacks, you normally see only the spine of the book. Oftentimes, even not that, because it's in the boxes, so you need to open the box, you need to take the item out. So in having access about all these different images, all different sides and all the book, you get more information than you get on the stacks. However, this is just a first way into the study of the object. You need to be able to study more details about it, and so there's more information that we need to gather there. Now, what happens generally is that when books are digitized, images are taken of all the different sides of the image of the pages, and then these are put online. Now, more and more, we're getting advanced digitization that still through visual means can give us access to the materiality and other aspects and features of the book that are not normally captured by normal photography. One example is X-ray photography that has been used since the 1950s to study book bolts and lacing patterns. And it's a very, at the time, it was an advanced methodology to be able to look at the ways in which the books was constructed without having to take it apart. On the same line, nowadays we are getting to very fine details by looking at still through X-rays, but through micro CT scans, where we get really to get to see the full object and in its minute details. This is an example from the St. Catherine's Gospel, which is the earliest example of the European binding. Now the cover has a very peculiar decoration under the leather, and we were unsure about how this decoration had been accomplished. Through X-rays and the CT scan, we were able to finally understand how this worked. Another example of micro CT scan has been used on a Coptic manuscript in a very bad state of conservation, as in it's a parchment book block that's been completely deteriorated, so it's a blocked, and you can't open the pages anymore. And this was scanned through with macro CT scan, and I love the way in which you can see the details of the chain sewing of the book, and we can start really to look at the object in very fine detail. Another technology that should mention is multispectral imaging. Now, multispectral imaging is normally thought of as a way to recover the underwriting from palimpsests, but because of the way in which the technology works, we can actually extract more information about the object. Specifically, we can start to understand how which different materials have been used on a page. This is an example from a brief study that we did on stains on manuscripts, using multispectral imaging as a way to map different materials that we found on pages. And in this particular example, we were able to understand that stain in the middle of the page was a stain that was done by the sloppy copyist that put on the page the ink that was used to write the text, but also the ink that was used to rule the text. And what happens is that because different materials react differently to different wavelengths, we can plot the reflectance of that particular portion of the image, and by this we can plot these spectral curves, and we can start to compare different materials. So materials that might even look the same to the naked eye, they would develop a different plot, and we can really start to distinguish materials. Now, multispectral imaging is very good as showing us the different materials on the full page. And then if we want to do more in-depth analysis, we can then go on with more advanced analytical tools like XRF, FTIR, Force, and others. But those generally are either very slow at doing very large portion of surface, or they are spot tests. So with multispectral imaging, we can do the full map, and then we can just go in and assess different materials through more advanced analytical tools. So all of this is information that we can gather and digitize and bring into the digital through what I call direct acquisition of visual means, really. However, not all features of a book can be digitized through direct acquisition. I refer to these generally as untransferable features, not meaning that these can't ever be transferable, but they're not transferable through normal digitization or even advanced imaging usually. And these are just a few examples of typical features that are not generally transferable through customary visual means and digitization. One thing that is particularly interesting is, for example, is the gathering structure of the book. And we'll see this in more detail in a little while. One thing that is interesting to notice is that when information about these features is actually put into a computer and brought to us through catalog or different means, this is generally done through metadata, which kind of brings us to understand a very important point, that what cannot be digitized through direct acquisition can still be described. And it can be described in a way that can be made usable also to a computer through models and metadata, descriptive metadata. One example is that of the gathering structures. Now, the gathering required for manuscripts is the fundamental structure of the book in codex format. However, when we come to look at books that have been digitized, what we normally see is simple sequences of images. And I refer to these as floating pages because the physical connection between the pages that were together to make the fold and through which the book could be sewn is not there because we can't photograph the fold unless we take the book apart. One project that tries to tackle this is Visco. Now, many of you, I believe, will be familiar with École. It's a project run, it seems, by Dot Porter and I and colleagues. And what École does is gives us a way to model the collection, the gathering structure of a book in codex format. And then through a series of visualization allows us to study it in more details and to export and share this information. One of the visualizations is a simple line drawing, like the one that we see here. And these are two gatherings from a particularly complex Greek manuscript and the Marciana National Library in Venice. These manuscripts went through two major restorations. And so all you can see here is actually what the book looks like. And it's very complex. And I believe that it would be very difficult to describe these kind of structures with collection formulas, which are the normal ways in which gathering structures are described in catalog or in other applications. What happens here is that the École allows us to describe these structures in a way that the computer understands it. And the drawings that you see here are automatically drawn by the computer by looking at the XML model that it's at the base of the whole system. Another visualization that École does is that to putting together again the pages that used to be together to make up the fold and the gathering. In this particular example from the Gallink-Syriac palimpsest, the pages are actually no longer physically together at all, as in the big bulk of the palimpsest is in a private collection outside of DC, and which is here represented by the black and white images, whereas the color images are from the Vatican Library. So now these two pages are an ocean apart, but they used to be physically connected in the original codex, and through École we can see them back together again. Obviously, the gathering structures is just one little example of a complex structure that the full codex is. Legatus, so the Legatus Research Center of the University of Arts London has devoted a lot of efforts in order for us to be able to digitize and describe and work with bookbinding structures. And in a similar way in which we are doing with the École, it gives us tools to be able to describe binding structures in a way that we can work with and utilize. One thing that we need to keep in mind, though, is there is a difference between physicality and materiality. With physicality, we mean the infinite set of physical attributes that make up the object as it is. So the full object has its physicality and it's an infinite set of things that we can look at. Whereas materiality, or we even refer to as materialities, is a set of emergent properties that really depend on the observer, so who is looking at the book, what information the observer wants to gather, and what information the observer wants to really describe and put into the digital if you want to digitize these features, which means that there is always something that is going to be only in the original object. But we can start to add more and more leaves on what I call the digital culture object, which is this cultural object that we can study also through the digital medium, and it will not be complete, but by adding more and more leaves on this cultural object, if a new COVID comes to tomorrow or a new reasons that doesn't allow us to access the original books, we can still start to study them even though we don't have access to them. So we can study them as objects. All of this through models and metadata. Now, as we said, I'm a book conservator. I'm not saying that the digital cultural object is going to replace the original object. The original object has its infinite set of information that is really embedded in its physicality, and just looking at the object, not even looking at the text and all the other features. But the digital cultural objects, when done according to proper standards, can allow us to study the original object even in more details, which will probably spring more questions, more research avenues, which will lead us back to the object to find more information, and then add another leaf to the digital cultural object in order for this to become even more, not complete, but more advanced. And this set up a kind of infinite loop that will always bring us back to the original object. So there will be no way in which we can really decode all the information that there is on the object, but more information can be digitized and more information can be really studied even through the digital medium. And this just takes us to completion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alberto. That was fascinating. And it's always good to be reminded of the limits of digitization and also to be reminded of the importance of metadata, which I hope will continue to come up in the next couple of days. I guess we're ready for questions, Dot.
I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but I can ask a question, I think. So you talked a lot about all of the different ways that we can digitize manuscripts to tell us things beyond just the pages themselves, which is what I think we normally think about digitization. And you also talked about the importance of metadata, which obviously I agree with you on all of these points. But one of the things that that I have, I don't know, trouble with sort of getting my head around is how we then go beyond having all of these little pots of data, pots of information, and putting it together in some way that we can actually use it all together. And I'd like to hear you maybe think out loud about how you think that might happen.
Thank you, Dot. Yeah, that is one of the problems. So we have all these different leaves, and in what I refer to as a digital cultural object, but all this information normally doesn't talk to each other. So it's one of the issues that I haven't really solved yet. And it's been on the back of my mind as yours for a long time. And one thing that seems to be a way forward is to translate all of this information into linked data and use a ontology or model that will allow us to bring everything together. And I've been experimenting with the Stokes CRM in order to be able to really point to all these different pots of information, as you call them, and to bring them together into one big system that allows us to really go from one to the other and know what's there and what's not there. Of course, this needs to be coupled with visualization, and the fact that we do have those images is still important because there is information that we can link to those images as well. So it has to be a system that allows us to go from just metadata to images of the object, and even highly advanced images like those coming from the 3D models from the CT scan. So it's a complex problem, but I think that linked data might be a way for us to really make it possible all these silos to be able to talk to each other. But I want to know what you think about it as well.
I think that sounds amazing, actually, and I'd love to talk to you more about that to see what you've done. While we've been talking, there are more questions. So Patrick Perkins has a question. So Patrick, do you want to?
Yeah. Hey, Alberto.
Hey, Patrick.
Great information, really interesting. I know at Penn, when we've had this discussion before, we've certainly kind of seen an increase in students, especially during the COVID age, citing digital resources like as perhaps inappropriately as primary resources. And I'm curious if you think that we'll ever get to a point where digital resources can actually be utilized as primary resources, or if that kind of title is exclusive to the physical object.
Well, that's a tough one because sometimes through the digital means you can see things that you wouldn't be able to see in the physical object. So at some point, even though the digital culture object is just a representation of the original object, there might be some features that are only visible there in a way or more understandable there. So I think that yes, if everything is done according to proper standards and you know exactly what you're looking at and you are aware of the biases that the model will bring, because every model is, as we've seen, is a way to describe the materiality of the object. So if you're aware of all this bias, yes, you can probably cite the cultural object, digital cultural object as a primary source. Bear in mind that it's still only another representation of the object, but there might be things that are only visible there, so it would be appropriate to call that, and I refer to that, I think.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. So I'm going to turn to Suzanne Paul, who has a great question. So Suzanne, do you want to unmute?
I think this was a follow-up to your question, Dot, about how much do you think this is the responsibility of the institution to hold all these pieces of information or gather them together? I think it's a real challenge.
It certainly is, and so that's the kind of the beauty of the linked data. I mean, I don't want to be naive. I'm very aware of the difficulties that linked data brings as well. But in being able to really use linked data, we can connect things that not necessarily are in need to be held together just in one institution. Advanced imaging brings the problem of having a lot of data that needs to be stored somewhere. So advanced imaging does bring problem of this kind, but the rest of things are normally just metadata. And as long as we have a way to identify all the different pieces together, then it's okay not to have it all in one big repository, I think. So the problem here then comes down to URIs and how to identify each different portion of the object. And this is a huge problem because, as we know, even just coming up with one URIs to describe each different manuscript is a problem. So going down to have URIs to describe uniquely each different bits of information in it, it's a real problem. But it's also a solution. So it doesn't need to be that just all the information are in one big repository by the institution.
All right, thank you. Anyone else who has questions, bring them this afternoon and we'll talk about them later.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. That was fantastic. And I'm excited to see the questions, and I'm excited to see the questions building in the chat. So we will definitely be returning to those this afternoon. All right, our final speaker this morning is Sarah Bowen Savant. Sarah is a professor at Aga Khan University, the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, and specializing in the cultural history of the Middle East and Iran from circa 600 to 1500. She is the author and editor of several books, including The New Muslims of Post-Conquest Iran, Tradition, Memory, and Conversion, which came out in 2013 and won the Saeed Sirjani Book Award, given by the International Society for Iranian Studies on behalf of the Persian Heritage Foundation. She's here today as the principal investigator of the KITAB project and co-PI of the Open Islamic Text Initiative. Her next book, based on the KITAB's data, will be completed in 2021, so we're looking forward to seeing that. And will be entitled A Cultural History of the Arabic Book. Today, she will be speaking on how intertextual is the historical Arabic tradition. So thank you and welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Can you hear me? Just to double check.
Yep.
Okay, great. I've also long been an admirer of SIMS and the seminar in particular, so I'm delighted to be here. And I hope that what I have to say won't strike the audience as too different. It will be more along the lines of what you do with machine readable texts. But the KITAB project, which now includes computer scientists and historians, about 16 of us, is very deeply interested in the book as a large topic and the interaction between what you can do with, let's say, considerations of the material object when put alongside the use of machine readable files. So I won't have too much time to get into that, but I hope that I'll give you some thought on that as I go. Right, so the interest just of KITAB, generally to say, is the transmission of Arabic texts. So this aspect of, we might say, the history of books, how texts were copied and recopied over time. And we're particularly interested in developing new digital methods that allow us to address what is really a very long-standing set of questions for Arabic. The Arabic tradition is enormous. It's in the current corpus 1.7 billion words, and that's all texts running from, let's say, about 750, 800 up until modern, and a huge bulk of that falls into the medieval period. The size of it really, I think, requires, if you want to try to get anything like a distant reading of it, new methods, and this is what we're geared towards. Fundamentally, the questions we want to address are maybe questions of cultural and history, circulation of ideas, and the formation of shared memories. And these are specifically the topics of the European Research Council grant that I'm running now. To put the work we're doing in maybe a wider context for, the 20-year plan or the life plan, we have sort of staged out and considered the work we do in a wider context. We're interested in working on corpus creation and curation, software, and these are the two topics I'll address now. But we also have an eye on the issue of digital reading. If I may, something like a Kindle reader for Arabic that allows access, so people throughout the Arabic reading world could have access to books they otherwise cannot access. To talk through some of these issues, I'll first start with corpus construction. And I'd just like to make you sort of aware of what we have maybe as a starting point and how we're working. We have, as I said, 1.7 billion words in the Arabic corpus, and this is really quite a lot. It's the largest portion of works by a country mile in the Open Islamic Text Initiative. The Open ITI, we began Maxime Romanov and Matt Miller a few years ago, and I've been working with a variety of collaborators. The Arabic, we were able to scrape really a lot of open source repositories. And so we have quite a large start. We are also using transcriptions now from manuscripts. We are doing OCRs, I'll come to in a minute. And anyway, this is a general picture, and the open access and open, I could say, collaboration is very much a part of the ethos of the entire project. The application we've put online now is one of our first, we're quite young projects. We've only had serious funding since 2018. But we have now online all of the book files. So when we do the release, we also have a continuously updated application that's public. Anyone can read it and get into our books. They can access the works from GitHub. So we're doing training now, beginning training sessions for humanists, as we all are called, to be able to access GitHub and also to be able to read files, annotate them on EditPad Pro, how to contribute back, some annotations of the files. There's, we can speak more about quality perhaps in the coming days, I'm sure. A lot of our files are really quite good, but there are problems. And we have now annotated, come to the next slide, 773 book files as of the last release in last month. And we record issues, the annotators, in files that we make as part of the openness of the project available to anyone to see. What you see on the right is the EditPad Pro user interface, which is perhaps not for everyone, but it's enormously useful and I think accessible, importantly, for really any undergraduate or MA student to use. And I think that's quite an important part of the project, is making all this available. We have, as Peter, I don't need to say very much. Thank you, Peter, you've helped us. We've been working with eScriptorium on OCR for print with funding from the Mellon Foundation. And we've sort of been experimenting a bit. Thank you very much to Benjamin Kiesling's advances, I think, if I understand right, on the line segmentation models for manuscripts. I've given just an example, and Ben, Peter, yours was much better. But the issue of line segmentation in manuscripts is quite a serious one. It's also an issue in print, and so we've had to work quite a lot on the issue of segmentation. But you can see here the user interface where we're working on Arabic, and we have, again, because of the already existing open repositories, the ability to frankly cut and paste into eScriptorium to increase training data. This is, in fact, what we did in 2017 when Matt and Maxime and I participated in a training data exercise that helped inform Kraken. So just to go through two uses, let's say, of the corpus now, and I think these do interact with what people might want to do and questions they might answer regarding manuscripts. And again, I hope to raise those in coming times. First, we're interested in text reuse detection. And as I said, the question of the intertextuality of the tradition, the way texts moved and were copied and recopied over time, the tradition is hugely intertextual. An algorithm that was originally developed by David Smith of Northeastern PASM has been at the heart of the project since before we received funding. And we work very closely with David now to try to alter, work with, adjust the parameters, turn the knobs of PASM to improve our results. Some key aspects of PASM would be that right now it's not informed by Arabic NLP. We've begun experimentations now with named entity recognition, which should improve some of the results of PASM. We've had, when we do alignments between texts automatically through this method, we require further work on names. I've given here more information than you need. This is probably an instance of too much information, but this talks through the mechanisms of how we run PASM. And if you look at the bottom, I've given a link where we describe in much more detail on our website. This is just an example of an output and a single record from PASM, and it gives you a sense of, even if you don't know Arabic, I think you can look at this and you can see that the words are quite close and the differences are noted. And as a team, we're reading these, and this is an example of a file, the relationship of all such pairs between two books. We're reading these files and trying to understand what they add up to in terms of the relationships between individual works and then works in the corpus as a whole. We have 848,000 of these files available now for study on GitHub. And when I release my monograph next year, we'll release the entirety of the text reuse data set. We've wanted to get it into shape to feel that we're ready for its release and can explain, as actually both speakers have said, the level and requirements of documentation are enormous. So we're trying very hard to document and to keep repositories working so that we will, our data and also our methods will be reusable by others. So this kind of data, should be available within a year, I would say, or a year and a half. Probably. One of the key aspects then of being able to put your texts that are maybe first in print format or transcriptions from manuscripts at the moment into machine readable format is to try to get these kind of larger pictures of what's going on in the Arabic tradition, or for that matter, any other. And this is a mapping of all of those alignment files, the 800,000 some files, and what their features are. So if you look at the one on the top, what you're seeing is a graph that shows you how many instances for every single one of those files of those alignments we have. The bottom line there is that we've got lots of data that's not very meaningful. We have lots of files that have just a small number of alignments. And I don't think those, at least if your questions are of a schematic nature, are very interesting. On the bottom graph, however, this is a graph that shows you, if you take any individual work within the corpus, how many records does it have in the largest instance of an alignment? So how much do most works have in common with another work? And in that case, most of our works are closely related to another work. And that, I think, is quite interesting in terms of the general networking of the tradition, one of our key questions. We've been able, through looking at these files, to start to back up actually and to ask ourselves more critically, what is reuse in the end? I mean, we started with this definition of, the alignments of text that we could find automatically, copied over time, perhaps schematic, perhaps not. And I think we've come to understand reuse in a more subtle way. And this graph here, and the set of graphs here, are what my attempt to try to work out a sort of scheme for thinking about reuse. If we want to think of it as a cube, we can say we've got instances where you have in the A section very precise alignments between two works with citations, so you know the relationship between them, and the extent, the number of words matched is very high. And I've given, two examples here, a work and it's, two witnesses to the same work is a good example. At the other extreme, you might have works that are in the G quadrant or the G cube, where you have small sections, relatively imprecise, poorly cited. And this manuscript here, we transcribed, one of my former MA students, Majid Motazar Mati, transcribed it, and then we ran it through PASM. And there's no indication in this manuscript from Istanbul from the 14th century of where the scribe was putting this marginal note from. But it was from we could track it down to a history from the 10th century. And it was just heavily, heavily excised from over 50 pages. So that's the kind of other sort of extreme of reuse, we could say. We're also exploring then historically these situations, and these are some of them that I'm looking at in the monograph. So thinking about how oral and writing interacted to produce kind of an acceptance of the reuse of texts and these other characteristics I describe here. The issue of, authority and the growth of urban centers are particularly important for some of the very large works that grow up in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the so-called millionaires, as we say. These are authors who created works of 1 million words or more. Turning then to citation practices. So there's two aspects to what I'm trying to outline with book history here. There's, of course, what we can see people doing through these reuse patterns, but then there's also what they say they're doing. And we're trying to put these two aspects together now. And there's lots of reasons that citation matters. I probably don't need to tell you all this. You're interested in book history. But to say that there's lots of uses both of the book history and also practically, if you want to interpret reuse or if you want to create things like web applications that have Arabic text, that have search, you need to be able to understand the ways in which names are being reused and who's being cited when. So these are some of our questions on this. Just to give you an example of a reuse situation that was particularly thorny, we have here an author from the 10th century, a well-known historian, who reused a text from his predecessor. He's a younger predecessor of himself. And we know they knew each other, but he never cites him. And I try to explain why this is the case. And it's not a plagiarism situation at all. It's an understanding about the way in which you curate knowledge, from the past and what you need to give credit for. And in fact, he's quite a curator, Tubbery, of previous sources. So we might say in this case, as an example of you don't thank the postman, and he's meticulously throughout his work citing the predecessor, but he's not mentioning him by name. We've done work on isnads and for machine learning and Islamic studies. This is a kind of sort of hot topic. We've been working on training data. So in the last year, we annotated 94,000 lines of training data from 54 books. And Ryan Muther, who's a student of David's, worked to try to create a model for isnads, so these chains of transmission citation devices that are really common in Arabic. So they have lists of names, and we want to be able to pull those name lists out and see how much citation there is, who's being cited, what are the networks that we might be able to construct. So this was just a first attempt that Ryan has done, and it was quite successful on what we did. I would note that this inter-annotator study showed how hard it is for us to agree amongst ourselves, the trainers. And we also did that for Ryan. Just an example we can sort of now measure the weight of citation in these large works, or any works actually in our corpus. And this will also be data that we're releasing in the next year and a half. We can also look within an individual work, and because we can map out with about 90% accuracy where these chains of transmission lie, we can then say where in a work does an author choose to cite and where does he not. And this is just an example from the previous author, Tubbery. And you can see it's a history that's ordered chronologically, and the earlier parts of the work have much more citation than the times closer to his own life, which is somewhat consistent with what I was saying about his reuse of his predecessor, Ibn Abi Tahir. An example of taking all that data and running it through R to show the distribution of isnads over time. So citation practices are not stagnant. They change, and this is a century distribution of the quantity of isnads as a percentage of works over a period of time here. And briefly, the 11th and 12th centuries are high points, for the use of these chains of transmission in Arabic works. Just by sort of a way of also bringing some depth to this discussion, I've taken a look at this work by Ibn Asakir, which is the largest work in our corpus, to try to understand what he's up to. And he has a very large number of isnads of these chains of transmission using Muther's model. And this first might strike us as odd. I mean, it's chained, he cites everything, he oversites, he cites enormous quantities of times for this work, which is partly a work of hadith, so reports about the prophet, partly a work about biographical word reading. When we put this alongside the file, the machine readable file, and we read it and search intelligently and write regular expressions and try to understand what's going on, we begin to see a pattern. He's citing actually lots and lots of people. He's also citing what probably are rather ephemeral works. And our colleague Konrad Hirschler in Berlin has written about rather messy manuscripts that he's worked on from the period, which is the 12th century, that are not, they occupy space between published and unpublished works. And this is the kind of stuff that I think Ibn Asakir is really using. We've taken and mapped these again, and to point out, this is an attempt to do named entity recognition to understand what is he actually up to, this author who has this large work. Where is he getting his material? And he says he cites the name of this very famous earlier author, Ibn Sa'd. And I don't think he's using Ibn Sa'd's work at all, to be honest. I think he's using it mediated through the works that Conrad describes. So we've worked in that to try to chart these, using named entity recognition to try to, and clustering. And this is just a rather elegant tube map of Ibn Asakir's use of Ibn Sa'd. But you can see the network is rather complicated, and this is only a slice of the data. There's much more. So just by conclusion, I'm hoping I'm giving you a picture into what one might do in thinking about book history. In the case of, we want to narrow down to the case of the last author, Ibn Asakir. There's different ways of citing, and I actually argue that he's using a people sort of driven model rather than a specific book driven model. text reuse data compared against chains of transmission, I think shows something about how he's working, which, you know, he cares a lot about people, less about books. And right, so there's, I think, a lot to think about when you are able to get into the files in this way and think about books in general. So I've given you in this rather quick tour, a list of links here that give different views into the project. I'm representing this group of people, and they all have different projects that are underway dealing with our data, and they all contribute in different ways from the computer science perspective, whether it be or historians. So I think that's enough, and I'll stop there. Thank you. Okay.
All right, thank you. Turning to the questions to the chat, I see a question from David Sheeby. David?
Hi. With all of that Arabic and all those curly cues that you have in the script, what features do you use to extract those loops and those curls above the line, below the line? And who does the programming for you?
Okay, so we're working with eScriptorium, and prior to that, we were doing training data generation on our own and working just with Kraken. So I guess the answer is that no one is going through and saying this is a specific feature and that's a specific feature, and I know those are specific features. What we're doing is we're giving the computer thousands of lines by which it can learn the patterns itself. And it notes, and we're quite confident, these are gold standard, you know, transcriptions. It learns what the curly cues and the variety look like by looking at examples. What we have discovered, though, is the obviously different typefaces have different features. And the question that we're investigating now through the Mellon Grant is whether you need different typeface models, you know, in order to get good OCR for print. And a recent sort of discussion that we've been having on the team is that, you know, the 19th century, when a lot of our works were printed, was a terribly creative period for typography. Mm-hmm. Even though on a formal basis, a lot of works might have, you know, belong to the same font, the varieties produce not perfect results, let's say, in the outputs from Kraken. So we're beginning to drift towards the idea that I think that a generalized model with a lot of data may be more robust. And in some cases, when, for example, you want to produce an edition or something like this, you might want to create a specific model for a specific work. And again, remembering that the Arabic works can be very, very long. This might be a smart use of resources. David Smith did a lot of OCR and did a lot of work with PASM on badly done OCR for print newspapers. So even OCR results below, say, 90% can be incredibly useful for mapping the intertextuality that we're interested in. But so, we get higher. Yeah.
So when you develop your templates using this deep learning, can you take the template and transfer it to somebody else so we don't have to go through the training procedure? That's question number one. And then question number two, if there's another script that has a lot of curly cues in it, like cursive Hebrew, the Sephardic type, not the Ashkenazi type, can we adapt your templates to a totally different script?
I'm doubtful on that, to be honest. We've been working with Syriac, we've been working with Arabic, we've been working with Persian. And a more pertinent question might be, to what extent can Arabic and Persian use the same models? And that would be really helpful because we don't have nearly as much in OCR outputs in Persian. But the models are, you know, it's a tricky question. To your first point, though, yes, you could export it. Sure, absolutely. I mean, everything we're doing, and in fact, if you look on GitHub now, under the OpenITI and also under KITAB, we're making everything as available as we can as we go. So even sometimes without documentation fully, because documentation takes some time to catch up to what we're working on. But yes, but it's, OCR is tricky, I think.
So you were saying that Arabic and Farsi can't use the same template?
Well, they're different, they're typically written with different scripts. So if you have, I don't know how much you know about the Persian often is slanted, right?
It's
so
very slanted, yeah.
Yeah, you have different line segmentation issues.
Right, but aside from the line segmentation, if you could skew it up so that the Farsi was written in a straight line, do you still capture the same letters using the Arabic script?
At some level. We haven't, but your question is pertinent. We have not experimented to see what level of accuracy can we get specifically by running Arabic models on Persian. And yeah.
And when you compensate for the differences in letters between the Arabic and the Farsi, it's just a question of a couple of dots here and there, whether they use a letter B or a letter T or something else. Who implements the changes, or do you just leave it to some deep learning program to capture the nuances?
Well, again, we're not providing, for example, an equation to say this looks like that specifically. And I guess one of the key things is that Kraken operates not on a letter segmentation, but on a line segmentation model. So it isn't trying to pull out, each one of those characters in its various forms. So that might be, I think that's where maybe the question is.
And question, how many lines do you need for a good learning model?
It's a great question. So when we did the experiment in 2017, we had 1,000 lines per typeface, and we had very good output with Kraken. We've actually had teething problems coming into eScriptorium on the line segmentation, although we expect it to improve and to allow us to OCR things we couldn't previously. But, it's something south of that, 1,000 lines. But again, what we haven't yet been able to show is whether, how generalized we can work with the models. And that's a question of research, really.
Thanks.
Thank
you.
Right.
There's a comment and a couple of questions. There's a comment from Peter regarding the question about modeling, reusing the models. You could start with a model for Arabic and retrain it on your type of Hebrew or Farsi. It will probably be much better than starting from scratch, even though it will still require more training. So there, that. And
thanks, Peter.
And then there's a question from Camilla. Camilla, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay. Sure, yeah, I'll go for it. I was just wondering if there are any plans for tracking the reuse of translated Arabic text in other traditions. So I'm specifically thinking of Spain and most Arabic and the sort of genres of lyric poetry that are prevalent in Al-Andalus.
So Ryan Muther is very interested in this question of interlingual techniques, but we haven't, to be honest, we haven't gotten there. I mean, it's quite a complex project.
Yeah,
driving, but would be fascinating. I work in both Arabic and Persian. I'm particularly interested in working between them myself, and it throws up other issues too. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that's it for time. So there are a couple of more questions, but this afternoon or after the break, we'll get back to them. So I'll turn it back to Lynn.
All right, well, thank you, Dot. And thank you to all our speakers. That was a really great start. I'm just so pleased with how this is going and exciting about all the discussions that are happening around it. It is 12:15 and we are set to start back at 2 p.m. Eastern time. I think that's 6 p.m. London time and 7 p.m. Central European time. You might want to check that. My math's not very good. But we will start back in an hour and 45 minutes. I'm going to try to play to start a stream of the lightning talks to run during the break. actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not quite sure this is going to work on my computer. So maybe one of the other hosts can help with this. But I will try to get that set up in the next 5 minutes. But other than that, I think we should give a silent round of applause to all of our speakers. They did a great job, and I look forward to seeing everyone back in an hour and 45 minutes.
All right. Thanks, Lynn. And I will try to set up the stream, and if it doesn't work, I'll set it up.
Okay.